Do you know that around 40% of English vocabulary is actually French? ئایا ئەزانیت کە لە دەوری لە سەوچی لە وشەسازی ئینگلیزی بە ئەسڵ هی زمانی فەرەنسیە؟ How did this happen? And how did this change the English that we speak and study today? Today, we'll look again at the history of the English language and how this can help you as you study English. Badas Pepekane, let's get started. After the Viking invasions of the 800s, Old English became stable and even became a literary language, and famous books like Beowulf were written. Latin was still the language of religion, but Old English was used for government and education and also among the common people. But all of this changed in the year 1066, when another invasion happened. This time it wasn't the Vikings from Scandinavia, but their descendants who had been settled in northern France for about 5 generations. These people were called Normans, which was just a French way to say Northmen, which is another word for Vikings. But by now, these Norman Vikings had become fully French, and they spoke their own dialect of French called Norman French. Their leader, William, led 5,000 men across the English Channel, and they defeated the English king in battle. And so he became William the Conqueror, the first Norman king of England. For around the next 200 to 300 years, Norman French became the language of government in England as well as the language of the upper classes. This was a dangerous time for the English language, when it might have disappeared. Even though English was still the language of the common people, it was no longer the language of power, the language of government and education. During these centuries, English borrowed many French words, as well as some French spelling and French grammar, and the language changed a lot from Old English, becoming a very different language that we call Middle English. If this had continued, English as we know it today would not exist. But the power of the French language over English was not going to last. Because the ruling class was French and only married other French people, the language never moved down to become the language of the common people, the ordinary people. And then in the 1300s, a terrible sickness called the Black Death killed half of the people in Europe. This sickness was worse in the cities where most of the rich and the powerful people lived. When half of the people in a society dies, this changes many things. And this had the effect of ending the power of Norman French and bringing back English as the language of government and education once again. Just like when it had replaced Latin in the very beginning, English found surprising success because of a sickness, because of a pandemic. Okay, Mamosta, this is interesting history, but does it matter for students of the English language today? Yes, it does matter because this history explains why English is such a unique and sometimes confusing language. Remember that English is originally a Germanic language, so our grammar is Germanic. And remember that a lot of Viking loanwords and spelling also came into English. Now add that a whole 40% of English words are actually French, which is a Latin-based language. This explains why English spelling is so difficult and sometimes inconsistent, because the systems of French words and spellings are now mixed with the systems of Germanic words and their spellings. Here are some French words that are now everyday English words: air, face, flower, condition, royal, opportunity, courage, and brilliance. And still today, many of the words that are considered advanced English vocabulary are actually French words. This is because of those 200 to 300 years where French was the language of government, power, and education. English grammar even has some exceptions where the adjective comes after the noun in the style of Kurdish or the style of other Latin languages because of this French influence. For example, when we say Attorney General. Sometimes you might feel frustrated as you learn English because it feels so complicated. But knowing this history can help you understand why there are so many rules for English spelling and grammar, and why there is such a huge and diverse vocabulary. Because the English language is really a mixing of different language systems together. The base is Germanic, and then you mix it with some Viking language, and mix it with some Latin, and add in a lot of French. خوشکو برایانی بەڕێز. سپاستانەکەم بۆ بەشدارکردنتان لەم وانایە. Thank you so much for watching this lesson. Until tomorrow, هەتا سبەینێ. خواحافیز.